Many things have been said about The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword over the years, some of it good and some of it bad, but through it all the one thing that has generally been agreed upon is that the game's dungeons are excellent. Even with dozens of trials in the franchise that precede them, Skyward Sword's dungeons are all still impressively innovative and push the envelope of what a Zelda dungeon can be. From Skyview Temple to Sky Keep, each of Skyward Sword's 7 dungeons brings something to the table that makes them unique, and it's why even the game's biggest detractors have to give them the credit they are due. In this video, we will examine each of them to see which Skyward Sword dungeon is the worst, and which is the best and deserving of that coveted top spot. With that said, welcome to every Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword dungeon ranked. When I think about what I like about Skyward Sword's Earth Temple, 3 things come to mind right away. The first is the music, which, while maybe not a track I'd listen to outside the game, really adds to the Earth Temple's fiery atmosphere. The second is the easy but fun boss battle against Scaldera, aka Flamin' Hot Mike Wazowski. And the last is the general aesthetic of the dungeon, which is far more Fire Temple than Earth Temple to me, but regardless, it's a look I enjoy. However, beyond those 3 aspects, the Earth Temple is a very short and forgettable dungeon that truly never left a lasting impression on me. My main problem is that I'm not particularly fond of the dungeon's main gimmick centered around using a ball to roll around on lava. While having a literal floor is lava dungeon sounds cool on paper, using this ball feels kind of slow and awkward, and ends up not being a ton of fun to use. You can crush enemies with it, which is a little satisfying I suppose, but most of the time I'd rather just be back on solid ground. It's not the worst thing in the world, but it does feel like a lame feature for the dungeon to be built around. My other big issue with the Earth Temple is that it just feels very generic and by the numbers from a design standpoint. Next to creative dungeons in Skyward Sword like Sky Keep and the Sand Ship, this feels pretty straightforward and dull by comparison. It has virtually no interesting or memorable puzzles, and unlike Skyview Temple before it, there's nothing new and exciting like the Beetle to be found. In fact, getting the bomb bag as a dungeon item has to be one of the most disappointing dungeon items in the franchise, despite the new ability to roll them like a bowling ball. The Earth Temple needed to debut a few more original ideas because even the Lizalfos, fun as they are to fight, are kind of standard enemies that aren't all that noteworthy or special. Overall, the Earth Temple just needed to do more to help itself stand out in the lineup of great dungeons that Skyward Sword has. It's one of the shortest 3D dungeons in the entire series, which is all the more reason it needed something impactful to keep it from being forgotten. With few set pieces or big moments throughout the dungeon, and a boss battle that might seem underwhelming compared to some of the ferocious monsters you fought in previous Zelda games, it's easy to see why this dungeon gets lost in the shuffle. It has its positive elements, but it's a pretty aggressively average Zelda dungeon, which unfortunately won't get it ranked any higher against Skyward Sword's other terrific dungeons. I enjoy the aesthetics of every single dungeon in The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword, but none as much as I enjoy those of the Lanayru mining facility. This might seem odd as initially the dungeon feels quite lifeless and dull, but once you hit a time stone and color floods the area, it becomes one of my favorite looking dungeons in the series. The industrial environment with moving conveyor belts and manually operated platforms really appeals to me, and I love the way they bring energy to the temple with their loud colors. It's an environment that I simply enjoy existing in, and along with the music that gives the dungeon a mysterious and dangerous feel, it's a big reason why this dungeon isn't ranked last. Another reason this trial doesn't sit at the bottom of the list is because there are a few puzzles that I thought were memorable. My favorite has to be the section where you have to navigate a submerged path with the use of your map. I often find myself completely ignoring the map when playing Zelda games, so it was refreshing to see it used directly to solve a puzzle in this way. Another puzzle I liked was the switch puzzle that needs to be solved in order to gain access to the boss key, mainly because I appreciate any puzzle that requires you to pay attention to your surroundings to figure out the solution. I also like fighting Nostalgia enemies, and the new Armos design and fight is cool too I suppose, but aside from that there isn't a lot else that I'm too fond of in the Lanayru mining facility. In general, the pace of this dungeon is far too slow for my liking, and I think that both the upgraded Hook Beetle that allows you to carry things, and the Gust Bellows that allow you to blow away enemies and obstacles are somewhat to blame for this. While I like the beetle overall, until you upgrade it to the quick beetle, it moves at a painfully slow rate that disturbs the game flow in my opinion. Lanayru mining facility requires you to use it on several occasions, and while not every puzzle involving it is bad per se, it's a chore to use most of the time. Similarly, the gust bellows have never felt particularly fun to use, and uncovering something under a pile of sand is less of a puzzle and more like busy work to me. I also found the boss battle against Moldarok to be pretty pathetic and a largely underwhelming way to end the dungeon. A complaint I have about Zelda bosses and Zelda enemies in general is that they just aren't aggressive enough, and Moldarok is a great example of that. I felt like for most of the fight he was just walking towards me and allowing me to strike his hands while not even really hinting at the idea of attacking me back. Then in its next phase, it burrows underground so you have to expose him by blowing sand away with the gust bellows, but this again feels more like busy work than an engaging challenge because at no point did he even come close to me while tunneling around. And when I finally did get him to charge me down, I didn't even need to sidestep him because I could walk backward fast enough to avoid him. While I like the Lanayru mining facility a little more than the Earth Temple, I think they are clearly in a tier below the rest of Skyward Sword's fantastic dungeons. As cool as switching between the past and present is in real time, this dungeon needed a few more standout moments to make it further up the list. Despite memorable sections like using stamina refills to race across a fast-moving conveyor belt, I just felt too let down by the disappointing boss and dungeon item and needed something else to wow me. Unfortunately, the Lanayru mining facility did the opposite and created the single most useless enemy in the franchise in the form of little scorpions called Arakas, which reinforced where this dungeon would rank for me. With a few good elements and a few not so good elements, I believe the Lanayru mining facility fits comfortably into the bottom half of Skyward Sword's dungeons. Because Zelda dungeons are not played in a vacuum, I've always thought that when you play a dungeon in the game can have a big impact on your impressions of it. For example, I know many people who wound up disliking the Palace of Twilight in The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess simply because they were ready for the end of the game and felt the dungeon unnecessarily delayed the satisfaction of getting there, rather than taking issue with the actual dungeon itself. In the case of the Fire Sanctuary, it finds itself in a tough position as well because while it's a good dungeon, it is sandwiched between the game's three most memorable trials. The Ancient Cistern and Sandship are generally considered to be some of the best Zelda dungeons in the entire franchise, while Skykeep has one of the most unique and memorable gimmicks, leaving the Fire Sanctuary feeling kind of plain and unremarkable by comparison. It doesn't help that it also shares a fire theme with the Earth Temple, making it harder to remember and easier to confuse with Skyward Sword's second dungeon. However, despite all this, when you look at the merits of the Fire Sanctuary independent of other trials in the game, what you'll find is a very solid dungeon with a lot of cool ideas. The main gimmick of this temple is centered around using the magma mitts to explore underground areas so that you can manipulate the surface above or progress to areas you otherwise couldn't reach, and I think it works pretty well. Although movement can be a little restrictive at times, I found myself really enjoying the tension of fighting the mold worms and had a lot of fun chasing down plats to get a piece of heart. Being able to launch bombs was also a cool feature that made me feel like I was playing a Bomberman minigame, and overall I was surprised by how positive I felt about these underground sections. Similarly, I found myself impressed at all the different ways water was utilized in this dungeon to solve puzzles. It's so surprising to me because it works so well, yet this is one of the only dungeons to do this despite the number of fire-themed trials found throughout the Zelda franchise. I remember having a bit of an aha moment when I realized I could stab the water balls onto my sword to carry them around, and using this ability to defeat the fire hands was a satisfying moment. Making the connection that, like the platforms you created earlier in the dungeon, you could turn these enemies to stone felt great, and I appreciate that Fee didn't handhold players to that solution. I also really enjoyed some of the magma interactions throughout the Fire Sanctuary, and felt they added to the dungeon's charm. In particular, the first time you meet Silva stands out because despite being suspended on a chain above a pool of lava, he remains pretty indignant and basically tells Link to piss off. It made me laugh a little that he'd be so rude given his situation, but then after you save him his attitude turns around, and he actually winds up giving you the magma mitts you'll need to complete the dungeon. I don't necessarily associate humor with a Zelda dungeon as usually there's no one for Link to interact with, but I think the Fire Sanctuary stands out in that way because while it's not drop dead funny or anything, when reflecting on this dungeon, interacting with the magmas is one of the first things that comes to mind. As I said earlier, I think the Fire Sanctuary suffers mainly from its placement in the game because I think it's an objectively good dungeon that simply gets overshadowed. Had this trial been second or third in the game, it would have seemed a lot more interesting and felt less like a letdown, but that's not to say it also doesn't have issues that hold it back. Fighting Girahim for a second time is pretty underwhelming considering the fight isn't that much more difficult or different from your first showdown in Skyview Temple. There are quite a few mini-bosses in the Fire Sanctuary, but most don't feel special or unique, and the design of the dungeon is a little too straightforward for the game's 6th trial, with most keys being obtained just before the door you need to unlock. Still, the Fire Sanctuary has a solid aesthetic and a good music track, so even though it's in the bottom half of Skyward Sword's dungeons, it's a respectable trial that's deserving of praise. If there's one thing that you can always count on when playing a Zelda game, it's that the first dungeon is usually going to be pretty good. Nintendo rightfully puts its best foot forward to make a good impression and hook players for the rest of the game, and they definitely accomplished their goal with Skyview Temple. After hours of largely story-driven gameplay, Skyview Temple is a refreshing change of pace for Skyward Sword with its clever puzzles and immersive atmosphere that show why Zelda dungeons are so beloved. There is such a great sense of progression felt here, and the trial offers so much without being too overwhelming or difficult. A perfect example of what I'm talking about is seen with the various eyeball puzzles throughout the dungeon. Typically in Zelda games, when you encounter an eyeball of any kind, your instinct is to shoot it with some sort of projectile, but these eyeballs are immune to slingshot bullets and skyward strikes. Instead, you have to figure out that you can make the eyeball dizzy by rotating your sword quickly in a circle, causing it to disappear and grant access to whatever it was guarding. It's a simple puzzle once you know the solution, but still satisfying to figure out because it subverts your expectations. Later on in the dungeon, we see this idea expanded on with a 2-eyed version, and again with a 3-eyed version, each of which adds another layer of complexity to the puzzle. Even though none of these puzzles wind up being all that difficult, it still feels good to solve them because overcoming progressively more complex challenges makes you feel smart. That to me is the magic of a Zelda dungeon and what makes them so enjoyable to work through. It's why I feel crisscrossing the opening rooms to raise the water level is a perfect snapshot of what I would consider the quintessential Zelda experience. It requires you to consider how your actions in one room might affect other rooms throughout the dungeon, and it feels great each time you return to a room you had visited before to access a switch you previously couldn't. To me, there isn't a greater joy to be had in a dungeon than finding the path forward on your own when it wasn't made clear to you, and Skyview Temple thankfully doesn't handhold you. Now overall, I have a very positive view of Skyward Sword's first dungeon, but there are a few minor complaints I want to address before wrapping up. While not exclusive to Skyview Temple, something introduced here that I dislike is the change made to the boss keys. Instead of getting a big key, you now get a sculpture of some kind that you must rotate so it perfectly lines up with the door, and I'm not really a fan of this mechanic. Perhaps I'm just dumb, but there were a few times where I spent multiple minutes trying to get these new keys to fit in their locks, and I felt it put a damper on a moment that is typically very satisfying. I can understand the developer's desire to make the boss key feel more special and significant, but as I already thought that they felt important, it feels like an unnecessary change that adds the potential of frustrating players that didn't exist before. That said, Skyview Temple's lock and key is by far the easiest to solve and not much of an issue, but as it introduced the concept, I felt it best to address the mechanic here. Beyond that, all my other issues with Skyview Temple are somewhat small, inconsequential nitpicks. Things like Fee's weird out of character post-boss dance, or the fact that the heart container just spawns instead of being left over from the remains of the boss, both of which again aren't issues exclusive to Skyview Temple. These things don't truly matter in the grand scheme of things, and even slightly bigger issues, like Girahim being too easy, don't really detract from Skyview's overall quality. Because while Skyward Sword's first dungeon isn't perfect, it is remarkably solid across the board. With an eerie, unsettling music track and a threatening setting that feels like a sharp contrast from the happy-go-lucky atmosphere of Skyloft, this dungeon checks off a lot of the boxes of what I'm looking for. And while it might not eclipse the quality of some of Skyward Sword's later dungeons, it set a high bar for them to clear. What I admire the most about Skyward Sword's final trial is how it is able to deliver a classic Zelda dungeon experience despite lacking several features that would typically be found within a conventional Zelda dungeon. You will not be finding a new inventory item to solve puzzles with here, and you won't be facing off with a boss to cap things off at the end either. Instead, you will be interacting with one of the most innovative mechanics a Zelda dungeon has ever had, as you manually shift each room of the dungeon to create a path forward. It's a wonderful gimmick that will test your spatial awareness and your ability to remember how each room connects to one another. If you hate slider puzzles, this may frustrate you a little, but even then I think it's still worthy of praise for presenting a new way to design a Zelda dungeon. I think what makes this gimmick work so well is that you can gain many simple joys just from rearranging the rooms. It feels good just to solve the slider puzzle, but it feels great when you can breathe a sigh of relief knowing you can progress by cutting through the shortcuts provided to you after rearranging a room you've already completed. It's also exciting to open up the way to a brand new room because they all do a great job of incorporating previous dungeon themes into their designs. In particular, I'm fond of the Skyview Temple room because it does a fantastic job of getting you to use your entire toolkit. You'll of course send out the beetle to grab bombs, but you'll also use the whip to cross bottomless pits and the gust bellows to gain momentum for several jumps. It appropriately feels like a final test of all your skills, and discovering these challenges with the room shifting mechanic is a lot of fun. However, if Skykeep's core mechanic wasn't memorable enough on its own, what helps this dungeon stand out even among the pantheon of great Zelda dungeons is the ability to collect the Triforce. Usually your quests revolve around getting fragments of just one of the 3 Triforce pieces, but here we not only assemble the full completed Triforce, we get to use it too. This is a standout moment to me because Link rarely gets to make a wish, as it's often someone else who is assembling or using the Triforce. The fact that Link is able to prevent a cataclysmic event from happening in his own timeline is hugely satisfying, even if the win is only somewhat temporary, and the cinematic of Skykeep falling to the surface and crushing the imprisoned is one of my favorites in the entire franchise. While not a traditional dungeon item, the Triforce remains one of, if not my favorite collectible to obtain in a Zelda dungeon, even if it has no real impact on the actual gameplay. Ultimately, how much you appreciate Skykeep will boil down to your opinion of its room shifting mechanic, as that's pretty much the dungeon's entire identity. While it does have its own music theme and a distinct aesthetic, these are only seen in a handful of rooms because, as I mentioned earlier, a majority borrow ideas from the previous 6 dungeons. With that in mind, I can see why some might be critical of this temple because with no item, boss, and mainly reused themes, there's not much else for the people who aren't fans of the dungeon's main gimmick. Thankfully, I've always been impressed by it, and it's why I can look past some of the lazier choices like bringing back the Sandship's Plank mini-boss to place it as Skyward Sword's 3rd best dungeon. When it comes to Skyward Sword's 5th dungeon, the Sandship, I really don't have much negative to say about it, so let's address what few issues I do have right off the top. It's been memed about to death, but I have to echo the statements made by so many that the boss of the Sandship is one of the most disappointing fights in the series. After an excellent dungeon, things seem promising as the build-up to the fight is intense and raises the stakes of the situation, only for Link to discover that his opponent is the receptionist from Monsters, Inc. It's such a letdown because not only is the boss not really all that intimidating outside its size, but the fight itself is laughably easy too. Dodging the tentacles that burst through the floor is pretty effortless, and its gigantic eye couldn't be any easier to hit with Skyward Sword's version of the bow. It's a fight where you feel like you're just going through the motions, which no level of epic setting could fix. Similarly, I found the Plank mini-boss was a joke that would have been over in seconds if not for it being a multi-phase fight. Each time he charged at me, I just spammed Link's thrust move and ate the few attacks he managed to get out, beating him with close to zero effort put in. I'm genuinely not sure how the Sandship managed to have such poor boss fights when everything else is so good, because I don't have many other complaints with the trial. It takes place in a unique setting, feels very cinematic throughout, and has tremendous puzzles and pacing as well. In fact, with all its positive qualities, I'd say the Sandship is easily one of the 10 best 3D Zelda dungeons in the franchise, and possibly one of the top 10 dungeons in the franchise overall. Undoubtedly, the use of time shift stones is what makes this trial such a thrill to play through, as it adds an extra dimension to the normal mental map dungeons ask you to create. Now, it's not enough to just understand the layout of the dungeon, because you'll also have to consider whether you should be in the past or present to progress as well. This is a fascinating dynamic that fills the dungeon with tons of terrific puzzles that provide plenty of opportunities for those satisfying moments of realization that make Zelda dungeons feel so rewarding. One of my favorite examples of this comes from the puzzle to unlock the boss key, where you must snipe a Beamos through some electrified charges that block a door. Afterwards, you can shift the time back to the present and return to the room to hit a previously blocked switch that grants access to the boss key room itself. Once inside, you must change the time back to the past again through a gap in the ceiling, which brings to life several enemies that, once defeated, finally grant you access to the key. This puzzle in particular stands out not only because it requires you to shift time back and forth, but also because it really stumped me initially. I hadn't thought to shoot the Beamos when I first encountered it, and immediately began trying to squeeze an arrow through the small gaps I could see in the present. The realization that I needed to be in the past to defeat the Beamos was a euphoric moment for me, because as soon as I figured it out, the rest of the puzzle was a breeze, and all the stress and tension I had built up while stuck got released. It felt like a huge weight off my chest, as I could now go directly to the boss and finish the dungeon, which is about as good a reward as I could think for solving a puzzle. Other great puzzles in the Sand Ship give you a similar feeling too, like solving the gemstone puzzle to receive a key that'll let you fight the mini-boss. It feels so good when you realize the wheel on the wall gives you the correct orientation to figure out how to read the clues given to you on the floor, and it's this kind of design that makes the Sand Ship one of my all-time favorite Zelda dungeons. Beyond its puzzles, I'm a really big fan of the version of the bow we get here on the Sand Ship. While not the most original item, its charge feature for increased accuracy is a welcome upgrade and allows the central time shift stone mechanic to work as well as it does. I also thoroughly enjoy collecting the piece of heart found in this dungeon, as ziplining from mast to mast is another standout moment for me. And while not my favorite music track in the game, the Sand Ship's music is very fitting for its Sand Sea setting and does a great job of creating the dungeon's mysterious atmosphere. All said, if the Sand Ship just had better boss battles, it would be in contention for Skyward Sword's best dungeon, but while it's still phenomenal, it has faults that the next dungeon on our list simply doesn't have. When I think of perfect 10 out of 10 Zelda dungeons, the Ancient Cistern is one of the few that spring to mind. While you can find a lot of really good or even great dungeons throughout the franchise, it's rare to see every aspect of a Zelda dungeon executed as well as what we see here. The Ancient Cistern's puzzles, dungeon design, atmosphere, music, boss fights, cinematics, core gimmick, and aesthetics are all on point and come together to deliver one of the most engaging and memorable dungeons in all of Zelda. Any complaints I could come up with would be extremely small nitpicks that have no true impact on the dungeon, as I only have positive things to say about Skyward Sword's 4th dungeon. There genuinely isn't a dull moment in the Ancient Cistern, as right away we are challenged with a fun gemstone puzzle similar to what we just discussed in the Sand Ship. To solve it, we must use our new underwater spin attack to quickly steal some silver rupees from a pair of giant stone hands, causing them to expose the back of their fist where important clues can be found. These clues, along with 2 others found on the opposite side of the room's central building, can then be deciphered using a stone tablet Link can find, which gives him the correct order to strike each gemstone to earn a key. It's an excellent opening puzzle because it's fun to put all this information together on your own, and it effectively sets the tone for the rest of the dungeon, as the Ancient Cistern's other challenges are similarly engaging. One that comes to mind immediately is the puzzle surrounding the boss key, where Link must use a rope to climb in and out of a creepy underworld area. It is a fantastic puzzle not only because it makes you consider how the position of the dungeon's central chamber will affect your access to the underworld, but also because it contains an incredible set piece that's among the most cinematic gameplay you'll find in the series. As you make your initial climb up the rope, these cursed Bokoblin enemies that you've been battling since you entered the underworld will begin to climb up after you to try and pull you back down to the depths. The intensity of trying to escape these disgusting creatures is unlike anything else in the entire game, and I could not imagine how scary this must be for anyone who played it as a young kid. Its vivid, thrilling nature makes it stand out as one of the best moments in any Zelda dungeon, and certainly all of Skyward Sword. Shifting gears, I understand the Ancient Cistern's dungeon item might not impress some, as the whip is essentially just a different version of Wind Waker's grappling hook, but I found many of its uses quite enjoyable. Being able to pull levers and switches, as well as swing from various structures is fun, and I particularly enjoyed some of the puzzles where you had to use the whip to flip over lily pads. By far my favorite use of the whip, however, was stealing a key from a Bokoblin guard through a gap in a steel bar because it made me feel like James Bond in GoldenEye 007. I love it when items have multiple uses, so this instance left a big impression on me and made me more fond of the whip than I originally thought I would be. Finally, I want to sing the praises of the Ancient Cistern's boss battles, which are easily my favorite in Skyward Sword. The Stallmaster was an impressive mini-boss in his own right, but it's the dungeon's final boss Kalaktos that deserves the bulk of the praise. Fighting this monster and ripping his arms off with the whip was so cathartic, and I loved destroying him with his own swords. As far as Zelda bosses go, he provided a good challenge as well, and it was extremely gratifying to get a sword upgrade after winning that doubled its power and increased its length. Aside from the Triforce and Skykeep, it is perhaps my favorite reward for completing a 3D Zelda dungeon and caps off an amazing trial. I could honestly go on and on about the Ancient Cistern because I didn't even really talk much about its music and aesthetic, which are both great and worthy of praise. However, I think all you need to know is that if I was making a Mount Rushmore of Zelda dungeons from throughout the franchise, 2D or 3D, then the Ancient Cistern would undoubtedly have a spot. While I believe that The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword is a pretty mediocre game overall, I cannot say the same thing about its tremendous dungeons. Even at their worst, the trials in this game are fun challenges that remind me why I miss traditional dungeons as much as I do. Whether it's their beautiful aesthetics, their interesting gimmicks, or their clever puzzles, each of Skyward Sword's dungeons excels in one way or another. And while I'm not necessarily chomping at the bit to replay Skyward Sword anytime soon, I know if and when I do, it'll only be to experience these fantastic trials once again.